Take a look at this population density map of Russia. The country spans 11 time zones and 2 continents, covering a sixth of the Earth's landmass. But notice how almost all the human activity is concentrated right here on the western edge. 80% of Russian citizens live on just 20% of the land, leaving the massive eastern expanse in near total darkness. When you look at that massive empty space, the obvious explanation seems to be the climate. Eastern Russia is notoriously freezing, with winter temperatures regularly plunging to -90 degrees Fahrenheit. But humans will endure extreme cold if there's a good reason. During the Klondike Gold Rush, tens of thousands of settlers poured into Alaska. Today, Alaska has a growing population, an expansive highway network, and a thriving economy built on oil and mineral extraction. People will build in the freezing cold if the geography supports it and the economic rewards are high enough. In Siberia, the air temperature is only half the problem. A far more destructive threat to human settlement lies buried directly beneath the surface. Russia's defining asset, its immense territorial size, is actually a geographic trap. The landscape actively resists human habitation. Roughly 65% of Russian territory sits on top of permafrost. For thousands of years, this mixture of soil, rock, and ice remained permanently frozen, providing a foundation as hard as concrete. But that foundation is cracking. According to Russia's own Ministry of Natural Resources, average temperatures in Siberia are rising nearly 4 times faster than the global average. When permafrost warms, the ice binding it together melts, turning the ground into a deep layer of liquid mud. Building a heavy industrial city on thawing permafrost is like trying to balance skyscrapers on a bowl of jello. Look at the scale of the industrial complex in Norilsk, Russia's northernmost city. You have heavy factories, massive smokestacks, and sprawling concrete infrastructure resting on this failing ground. Today, over 60% of the buildings here show critical structural damage as the earth gives way beneath them. Russia's foundational bedrock is melting, and the state is watching its own cities physically collapse into the earth. If the ground is so hostile and unstable, why do these massive, heavily populated industrial centers exist here in the first place? The answer goes back to the 16th century. The initial push eastward was driven by the global demand for luxury furs. Russian explorers and traders conquered this territory to harvest sable pelts, which were worth their weight in gold. By the 20th century, the Soviet Union realized this freezing wasteland held a different kind of treasure: massive deposits of gold, oil, coal, and nickel. But ordinary citizens refused to move there to extract it, so Joseph Stalin forced them. Between the 1920s and the 1950s, his regime sent millions of political prisoners and forced laborers to extreme environment prison camps known as the Gulag system. These laborers were worked to death in the freezing cold. They dug the mines, built the factories, and laid the tracks for the thousands of miles of the Trans-Siberian Railway, breaking through the wilderness by hand. Siberia is an entirely artificial empire. It is a region forced into existence by state violence, built in direct defiance of geographic reality, and that geographic reality fights back at every turn. Almost all of Russia's major Siberian rivers flow north to south. They empty out into the frozen Arctic Ocean instead of running east to west, failing to connect the resource-rich eastern territories with the populations in the west. Transporting goods over land isn't much better. This is the infamous Kolyma Highway, known as the Road of Bones. During the summer rains, extreme weather variations turn the region's few unpaved routes into impassable, muddy quagmires. The situation is deteriorating rapidly as the ground warms. Siberia's thawing permafrost holds an estimated 1.6 trillion tons of carbon. As it melts, it releases massive amounts of carbon dioxide and highly potent methane gas into the atmosphere. Sometimes that methane buildup triggers a violent explosion. Massive craters like this one, some measuring over 50 meters wide and 30 meters deep, are blowing straight out of the earth, swallowing up the landscape and threatening pipelines. The shifting climate also fuels massive ecological disasters. Millions of acres of Siberian forests are burning. These include zombie fires, wildfires that smolder deep underground in the peat all winter long, only to erupt into massive infernos in the spring. The thaw is even waking up biological threats. Ancient, dormant pathogens frozen for millennia, like anthrax, are melting out of the soil, infecting local reindeer herds and the people living nearby. Constructing and maintaining infrastructure in this environment costs up to 7 times more than it does in Western Russia. The state economy is caught in a bleeding cycle of constant repair, trying to patch up a landscape that is tearing itself apart. For the people actually living in the Russian Far East, daily life is a losing battle against extreme isolation and crumbling surroundings. Roads crack, buildings sink, and basic public services become increasingly unreliable. For indigenous groups, the cost is even higher. Take the Nenets reindeer herders. For centuries, they navigated stable tundra. Now, the ground is fragmenting into new lakes and sinking mud, destroying the traditional migration routes and erasing a culture that survived here for generations. Faced with these impossible conditions, residents are leaving. Since 2022, the Russian Far East has lost hundreds of thousands of people. Birth rates are dropping, and young professionals are fleeing west, creating a demographic death spiral. The government is quietly capitulating. In towns like Vorkuta, local municipalities are actively demolishing dozens of abandoned apartment blocks, simply because they can no longer afford the exorbitant costs of maintaining them on shifting ground. Russia is experiencing a slow-motion population collapse. The state is abandoning its own eastern territory because it can no longer afford the financial toll of fighting the geography. This physical collapse is now a direct threat to Russia's military readiness. Strategic lifelines like the Trans-Siberian Railway require constant emergency repairs, and northern nuclear submarine bases are seeing their shorelines literally erode into the sea. The geopolitical irony here is sharp. Vladimir Putin has poured Russia's military strength, manpower, and financial reserves into a war of expansion in the West. But in doing so, he has left a massive, undefended power vacuum in his collapsing East. Look at this map of the Russian Far East and the Chinese border. Chinese economic influence is surging northward. Chinese firms are buying controlling stakes in critical Siberian resource extraction, dominating local commercial real estate, and leasing hundreds of thousands of hectares of Russian agricultural land. Russia's defining national characteristic, its vast territorial size, has become a fatal liability. Stripped of the capital, the technology, and the population needed to maintain control over its own hostile geography, the Russian Empire is quite literally melting away from within. This density map reveals a lopsided reality. Russia concentrates 80% of its people into a tiny western sliver. East of the Ural Mountains lies an empty expanse, larger than the US and Mexico combined, yet supporting just 25% of the population. The geography here actively prevents standard settlement. The major river systems, the Ob, the Yenisei, and the Lena, all flow directly north. They empty into the frozen Arctic Ocean, providing no water-based trade routes to the rest of the world. Under standard geographic laws, this land should be empty of major human settlement. Yet the Russian Far East is dotted with massive industrial centers and concrete apartment blocks that rise directly out of the frozen tundra. This is a climate that actively rejects human habitation. In cities like Yakutsk, winter temperatures routinely crash past -60 degrees Fahrenheit, a level of cold that makes basic survival a struggle. These brutalist towers are the remnants of a massive, artificial human experiment, a relentless drive to force civilization onto the ice. To understand why these cities exist, we have to look at how the Soviet machine attempted to overwrite the laws of nature. The prize was $75 trillion in raw wealth, natural gas, gold, and rare earth metals buried deep beneath the permafrost. But in a free market, this was unreachable. Building on shifting permafrost costs up to 7 times more, requiring foundations anchored tens of meters into the ice. The Soviet Union bypassed these financial constraints by removing human choice from the equation. Between the 1920s and the 1950s, the state moved 18 million people into the eastern void at gunpoint. The Soviet state sidestepped the physical obstacles of the East by subsidizing the economy with human lives. Under the Gulag system, political prisoners were forced to mine resources with pickaxes in -90-degree weather, working until the cold or exhaustion killed them. This expendable labor force manually laid the transportation lifelines through the wilderness, providing the reach the state needed to extract its buried treasure. 130,000 prisoners died constructing the Kolyma Highway. Their bodies were buried directly into the foundation, earning the route its name, the Road of Bones. The cities built by this labor, like Norilsk and Vorkuta, became resource black holes. They were never self-sustaining, requiring massive, constant subsidies from Moscow just to keep the heating pipes from freezing solid. The entire eastern frontier was an artificial construct, held together only by the authoritarian force and endless wealth of a central state. When the Soviet Union collapsed in 1991, the central subsidies that kept these resource black holes warm instantly evaporated. The demographic reaction was immediate. With the borders open and the funding gone, the Far East lost over 20% of its population as citizens fled back to the West. Thousands of Soviet apartment blocks were left to the elements. Once thriving industrial hubs became ghost towns, buried in snow and reclaimed by the landscape. Without the threat of force or state funding, human beings naturally retreated from a geography that never supported their presence. Now, a final threat is finishing what the demographic collapse started. Climate change is warming Siberia 4 times faster than the global average. The solid permafrost that anchors these artificial cities is melting. The frozen ground is turning into unstable liquid mud. The physical toll is visible across the region. Entire buildings are splitting, tilting, and collapsing as the earth gives way beneath their foundations. Repairing this melting infrastructure would cost an estimated $250 billion, money the isolated Russian state does not have. Despite modern attempts to pivot the economy eastward, the Soviet campaign to conquer this geography has failed. The subsidies are gone, the ground is melting, and nature is taking the land back. Look at the frozen Amur River. It acts as a physical boundary between 2 completely different geographic realities. On the Russian side, the Far East spans 7 million square kilometers, yet holds fewer than 8 million people. Cross the river into China's Manchuria, and the math inverts. Over 100 million people pressed right against the border. That proximity exerts intense physical pressure. China is actively projecting its economic and military presence directly on the ice of this boundary. An empty expanse bordering a densely packed neighbor creates a massive demographic vacuum. It sets the stage for a quiet, unfolding geopolitical crisis. Russia's population distribution is severely skewed. 80% of its citizens are packed strictly into the western 20% of the country's landmass. Historically, this empty eastern expanse served a vital purpose. Conquered for its resources, it functioned as the ultimate defense-in-depth shield, a frozen wilderness designed to exhaust and swallow any invading army marching toward Moscow. Today, the Kremlin is handing out free land and slashing taxes in a desperate bid to populate this exact region. But instead of settling the frontier, residents are actively fleeing west. Maintaining control over these massive distances is now placing growing strain on the central government's resources. 77% of Russian territory sits on permafrost, and right now, that soil is warming 4 times faster than the global average, turning solid ground into bubbling mud. In northern cities like Norilsk, up to 60% of all buildings now show critical structural damage. Entire apartment blocks are cracking and sinking as their foundations melt away. Beneath the surface, trapped methane gas is violently releasing, ripping massive sudden craters into the landscape. This chart shows the baseline cost of infrastructure maintenance. Because of this freezing and shifting terrain, keeping basic railways and roads intact in Siberia costs 3 to 7 times more than similar projects in Western Russia. This creates an inescapable economic black hole. Internal government assessments project that simply repairing permafrost damage could soon consume up to 15% of Russia's entire GDP. As the roads buckle and the extreme weather worsens, the region is experiencing a severe demographic exodus. Young professionals are packing up and heading west. The sheer distance between these shrinking towns makes maintaining basic societal functions impossible. Operating schools and hospitals for a dwindling population across thousands of kilometers is mathematically ruinous. It is worth remembering that Siberian development historically relied on the forced labor of the Soviet Gulag system. It was never driven by voluntary settlement. Without the brutal mechanics of state coercion to force people eastward, the expansion is rapidly reversing. Siberia is being left behind as a hollowed-out ghost country. The irony is that this emptying region contains unparalleled wealth. The soil is packed with massive deposits of oil, nickel, and the rare earth elements required for the global green transition. But Moscow cannot extract this wealth alone. Locked out of Western capital by sanctions and facing extreme distances with a vanishing domestic workforce, Russia lacks the capacity to mine its own territory. Chinese capital and state-backed entities are aggressively stepping into this exact void, exploiting the structural weakness to secure resources below market rates. This chart breaks down the ownership of the Tomtor rare earth deposit. Chinese firms are demanding ownership stakes up to 70% to develop these strategic sites, while simultaneously leasing 500,000 hectares of Russian agricultural land. These terms transfer the control of critical resource extraction directly to Beijing, as Moscow finds itself unable to fund its own development. This severe economic dependency is creating domestic political fallout. Local officials in Siberia and the Far East are increasingly turning their loyalty to Beijing for basic survival. This visualization highlights recent survey data of regional administrators. 68% made official visits to China, while only 31% traveled to their own capital in Moscow. The breaking point arrived in April 2025 with a sweeping new agreement out of the Primorsky Krai region. Regional authorities bypassed federal oversight entirely. They signed direct cross-border infrastructure deals with China's Heilongjiang province, cutting Moscow out of the loop. By authorizing their own international projects, these regional governments are beginning to operate outside of the Kremlin's direct economic control. The Kremlin heavily promotes a powerful pivot to the east, but the reality on the ground is a quiet submission to a stronger neighbor. The boundless geography that historically fueled Russian exceptionalism has become an inescapable liability. The sheer scale of the land is unmaking the state from within. No amount of military aggression or nationalist rhetoric can refreeze the permafrost. No political decree can shrink the thousands of kilometers of empty wilderness. With a shrinking population and thawing ground, Russia's eastern territories are becoming increasingly integrated into China's industrial supply chain.